Hello again. Last time, we talked about a man who God chose to lead the Israelites after Moses died. You guys remember who that was? It was Joshua. Now, not only was he the leader of the whole group of Israelites, he was also the commander of the men who were the fighters and soldiers, the Israelite army. Well, sometime after God held back the water of the Jordan River so that all the Israelites could cross on dry ground, they camped near a city called Jericho. And it's here where we continue the true story of Joshua, the Israelites, and how their obedience to God led to something incredible. Okay, so this wall represents the city of Jericho, which was heavily fortified. And that means that the walls were very strong, and it was not easy to get in because it was locked up tight. The Israelite army wasn't going to just walk up to the door and ask their enemy to let them in so they could take over the city. So now, I present to you the true story of how Joshua and the Israelites obeyed God and were blessed with, well, you'll have to wait and see. Allow me to set the stage. God spoke to Joshua and gave him some very specific instructions. You and your fighting men should march around the town once a day for 6 days. 7 priests will walk ahead of the ark, each carrying a ram's horn. On the 7th day, you are to march around the town 7 times with the priests blowing the horns. When you hear the priests give one long blast on the ram's horns, have all the people shout as loud as they can, and then the walls of the town will collapse and the people can charge straight into the town. That's from Joshua chapter 6, verses 3 through 5. And that's what Joshua told the men, and that's what they did. They obeyed God. Joshua told some of the soldiers to march in front, followed by priests blowing ram's horns, which would have probably looked something like this. Joshua told the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant to walk behind the ram horn playing priests. The Ark of the Covenant was a very special chest that held things like the 10 Commandment stone tablets, and it helped the Israelites remember that God's presence was with them. Finally, Joshua had some more soldiers march behind the Ark of the Covenant. And then Joshua told them to march around the town, but no one was to speak. And the group obeyed. The first day, they marched around the city 1 time. And then they went back to camp. And the next day, they got up and walked around the city again. And then they went back to camp. And then the next day, well, you get the picture. For 6 days, the men marched around the city 1 time per day. And the only sound they made was the priests playing their horns. But then, on the 7th day, they did something a little bit different. Let's look back at part of verses 4 and 5 in Joshua chapter 6 again. On the 7th day, you are to march around the town 7 times with the priests blowing the horns. When you hear the priests give one long blast on the ram's horns, have all the people shout as loud as they can. What do you think they did? They obeyed God's instructions. Joshua and the rest of the army got into position near the city wall and began to march. They marched 1 time. 2 times, 3 times, 4, 5, 6, and 7 times around the wall. And after the 7th time, the priests with horns gave a long blast, and Joshua said, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the town." And all the rest of the Israelite people shouted, "Ah!" And suddenly the walls of Jericho came crashing down. Whew. Well, the Bible tells us that the Israelites then charged into the city that was no longer protected and destroyed everything, capturing the city in the process just as God had promised. Did Joshua and the Israelites obey God in our true Bible story today? Yes. Help me say that bottom line. Obey God. Did the Israelites always obey God? Nope. And honestly, we don't always obey either. But through the true stories we've heard last week and today, we've seen a couple great examples of what it looks like to obey God by walking it out in our lives. That is, choosing to obey the instructions and commands God gives us. Obedience to God doesn't always lead to rewards or getting what you think you want. In fact, God never told the Israelites that they could have whatever they wanted if they obeyed Him. But He did promise them specifically that He would give them the city of Jericho. And then He gave them instructions. Then they obeyed. And then God gave them the city. That's pretty crazy awesome how that works, huh? Well, God always keeps His promises. And He expects us to obey Him. When it's easy, when it's hard, always. Even when the instructions seem a little crazy? Yep, even when the instructions seem a little crazy. What God told Joshua and the Israelites to do to conquer Jericho is not how a typical army would battle and take over a highly defended city. It was unusual for sure. But when they obeyed, they got to experience God's blessings in their lives. And that is a good example for us too. No matter how impossible or crazy God's commands and instructions seem, we can trust God to give us what we need to be obedient through the power of His Holy Spirit. Nothing is impossible for God. Trust Him. Obey Him. Obey God. Let's say that bottom line again. Obey God. I can confidently say you will never go wrong if you are obeying God. See you.